everyone, and thank you so much, Medina, for the introduction. I feel so honored to have the opportunity to speak to you on different topics. And for the last week and this week, I've actually enjoyed learning from you and with you. And I want to also say that I've been able and I can always articulate authoritatively with evidence a lot of the things that I argue, not just because of my transdisciplinary training, but because of spaces like this one, where I meet people like you and we remain in touch. And the conversations about progress and what's happening in your respective countries have always been discussed in a way that have helped me as an academic and someone that is interested in this topic. And so my wish for you is that after this program, it doesn't end here, that we go back with what we've learned, that we make good trouble with it by passing the knowledge on to our colleagues, that we question when opportunities arises to engage in honest conversations about what can be done differently. And like me, I hope that you feel that you've also learned a lot and made connections with people that will go with you for the rest of your days. And so to my topic, cooperation and collaborative measures to fight IU fishing. I'm sure at this point you already understand that a lot of the progress and examples we've heard about, the things that are going right have almost always come from interagency cooperation and collaboration, or even interregional and international cooperation. And so it tells you actually that if you want to go far, as the African proverb says, you go together, but if you want to go fast, you go alone. So basically, sustainability can only be achieved if we do it as a collective. And so this is the outline of my presentation. I'll look at why cooperation matters, and then explore some of the regional cooperation and collaboration in action, give examples of international collaborations, challenges that we'll face. I will introduce in a bit more detail the idea of a combined maritime task force, which I hinted at yesterday. I will assess areas of future improvement, and then I'll conclude. Without rehashing, obviously, we've seen that cooperation is very important because of the transboundary nature of fish and a lot of fisheries crime or crime in the fisheries sector and other threats that we've been discussing. And so if we then add to limitations around monitoring, surveillance, and control, and then the size of countries and financial constraints, you find that actually cooperation is the only way out of it. Collaboration with different agencies and countries is the only way we can improve things in a more sustainable way. And so what are some of the examples? I think some of this have actually already been discussed with the presentation from our colleague from Cresmao. He talked about the MOU and between ECOWAS countries in relation to fisheries. So I've tried to sort of highlight the examples that relate to efforts to combat IU fishing. So in 2022, the ECOWAS Commission signed an MOU, Memorandum of Understanding, with the Fisheries Committee for West Central Gulf of Guinea and the Sub-Regional Fisheries Commission on combating IU fishing. And then in March this year, I already highlighted this when trying to talk about the impetus for us to actually try out the Pacific Island example of negotiating agreement as a collective, as a way of also improving monitoring. And it seems that if things work well, it could happen because already ECOWAS have given their blessings following the experts meeting in Abidjan earlier this year, which made that recommendation. And then the communique from the 67 ECOWAS heads of state meeting in June this year, which also gave states the blessings to go ahead and explore further how this could work. And so these are just some examples, because a lot of the time we say there's lack of political will. And I guess this is an example of potentially political will. Is then a case of how can this be taken from the discussion table to practicalize it? And I feel that with templates like that of the Pacific Island nations, there is room or even an opportunity for them to learn from them, even if it means sending delegates from here to that part of the world to ask them, how are you doing it? How did you do it? And we learn lessons. Other examples, I want to highlight Operation Junction Rain from 2019, wherein Cote d'Ivoire and the US law enforcement intercepted 45 of 64 vessels that they caught at the time or that they inspected at the time engaging in IUU fishing. So it tells you the potential level of threat that is going on in our waters. And then 2020, I've already talked about the Heirloom Feng 11, and it was based on cooperation and collaboration. And I actually want to highlight that Heirloom Feng 11, the interception was possible because of also cooperation between Fisheries Department in Cote d'Ivoire and the Fisheries Committee for West Central Gulf of Guinea. So already you see that if communication about what's going on happens on time, despite the limitation in infrastructure to interdict, it is possible to actually catch pirates in action without losing lives, and I guess you could say ensure sanity in the maritime space. In the same year, which is very interesting, after saving the crews of Heirloom Feng 11 from pirates, Nigeria fined the Heirloom Feng 11 for incursions into Nigerian waters, fishing illegally. And so the conversations we had before about reflecting about the potential connection between illegal fishing and being victims of piracy is something that you should also be thinking about if you're not law enforcement. If you're with maritime law enforcement, such as the Navy, you might already had this experience because in conversation with different naval officers in the course of my work, they have given different examples of how potentially it's a case of being at the wrong place at the wrong time because you shouldn't be where you are in the first place. This is how you end up being victim of piracy. So it's open to conversation. Then the example from Yaris, which we've already discussed yesterday about how technologies enabled the region to see more of what's happening and is actually giving an impetus to regional states to understand the extent of the threat and then make a decision sometimes of what they should prioritize or even what project they should accept when international partners to come to talk about partnership. And here I'm really highlighting the example from Guinea. We have a colleague from Guinea here that also not only symbolizes how vessels that are authorized to fish in countries can also take advantage of what they see as loopholes, and also in discussing fisheries crimes, how illegal oil bunkering is one example that actually interacts. Whenever you see IUU fishing, you're almost likely to see illegal oil bunkering because they need to refuel. And for many oil producing states in our region, this is something that they're very concerned about because a major part of their revenue is from oil. What are some of the international cooperation and collaboration? I've sort of highlighted the examples so that in the discussion, we can also see the disparities. And then the questions that some of us have asked around the politics of all this argument at the global level, regional and national level about the politics of sustainability would actually be brought to the fore, which is why I've given this example with EU countries. So as part of international cooperation, I want to highlight the carding system. You could say it's a positive way of ensuring that countries do something radically different to improve their waters. But if you also look at the reality here, you could say, okay, we are negotiating and punishing as an entity, but when it actually comes to holding the vessels responsible, we more or less abrogate responsibility to the states where the vessels are coming from. And these are some of the examples of the fine. You find that it pales into insignificance in terms of the severity of the punishment for countries that has been carded. So for example, there was a report that was produced by Router, and depending on who you're asking, they will tell you that that report potentially influenced the EU decision to give Cameroon a red card, because the red card came shortly after the report, right? The interesting thing, however, is that some of the vessels implicated were from these countries. And then look at the fine. In practice, the average fine imposed for a similar infringement ranged from about 200 euros in Cyprus, Lithuania, Estonia, to more than 7,000 in Spain. In some member states whose fishing fleets comprise large vessels or operate outside EU waters, maximum fines are very low consigning activity level, of which even if you wanted the port state to take responsibility, the fine is insignificant. Again, I'm highlighting this too because I feel that some of the conversation we've already had about the politics of it all is something we should also think about in thinking about the cooperation that we've had from different partners. More examples of cooperation and collaboration in combating IUU fishing. We have examples from 2018 of China canceling subsidies and licensing to companies that have been implicated with evidence of engaging in IUU fishing. And in case you're not already aware, the links, the things that show up in blue are hyperlinked, which I have hyperlinked for you to make it easy for you to access the source of the information once the PowerPoint is shared. And a lot of the links that I've used are open access. Then there's also improved fisheries governance. 11 of the West African countries are already, except Guinea-Bissau, have already ratified the Port State Measures Agreement, and 27 of the 38 on the African continent have done so as well. 9 out of 12 countries, except Liberia, Guinea, and Guinea-Bissau, have accepted the WTO agreement, and then, of course, catfish, because, I mean, we have learned something that in a way that we have learned examples from different countries, that if we're not brought together, we're not actually going to see, I mean, in my group 3, sometimes when we give an example, someone from Liberia could give an example, and then another person from Sierra Leone will come and say, I don't have anything to add, it's the same thing. And then someone from Ghana would say, oh, but this also happens. And then someone from Tanzania would say something else. And so we're able to see that a lot of the problems we have are common problems. And therefore, hopefully, this have given us an opportunity to understand the need more than ever for cooperation and collaboration. If we are having similar issues, it means that we need to bring our heads together to find a way to solve it as a collective rather than doing it alone, amidst the limitations and the resources that we've already established that the region have. Challenges. Okay, yeah. Challenges and opportunities for improvement. I mean, despite the frameworks that already exist, we still see IUU fishing as a very big issue. Maybe because of legal capacity or legal capacity, which we've also heard about, the lack of legal finish in a lot of the cases. We find that, for instance, this paper from 2017 noted that an estimated $2.7 billion is the cost of IUU fishing for 6 West African countries, the one listed between 2010 and 2016. However, only 13 million of this is recovered through MCS. So obviously, despite a lot of the things, there's still a lot of gaps. And like I noted earlier, the clandestine nature of a threat makes it impossible for us to actually understand or ascertain how much we lose. We could be losing a lot more, but at least this gives us an idea and hopefully gives motivation to politicians to want to act to address the threats. The lack of will and resource gaps are barriers, especially when frameworks exist. I mean, a lot of countries in our region have signed up to a lot of these things, and sometimes you question whether it's a case of let's attend the party and sign, knowing that one will come back, we're not going to implement. So sometimes it's not even, the problem is not the lack of frameworks, the problem is implementation or the ability to actually sustain the implementation, especially when it has been supported by external actors. Because what you find then is that when the money goes, everything goes. Even the success you've recorded stopped because the government have not taken it up or have not had a clear roadmap for taking it up. A very big thing I want to highlight, and this was why during the presentation by SRFC, was when they said they had a hot pursuit agreement, which is something that allows countries to pursue illegal fishing vessels from country A to country B. In relation to piracy, before a lot of the countries in the region strengthened their laws, and even for ECOWAS until 2022, when they had this agreement wherein countries can send criminals to another country where the law does not exist. We're finding that A vessel will just commit a crime in Nigeria, for instance, and jump into Ghana, from Ghana to Benin, and everything else. And because there's no hot pursuit agreement in place in West Africa, they can still continue to do that despite the agreements that we have, even in relation to piracy. Again, this is doable because in Central Africa, they have had hot pursuit agreement for a while, which is helping, especially Zone D, which Cameroon is championing to address the threat of piracy, and I think also in relation to illegal fishing. And if it is already the case that there is some sort of hot pursuit agreement in place for sub-regional fisheries commission region, as I heard from the presentation, if I'm not mistaken, then already there's an impetus for this to happen. There's a template. We can make an argument, actually, we should, despite the suspicions, despite the worry about potential implication on sovereignty, something like this already exists. We should actually consider having it because it's very important for stemming the tides of illegal fishing and other crime in the fishery sector. There's also a need to review the laws and involving small-scale fishers, including women in monitoring fisheries management. And this is very important in terms of the role of the local people. I'm emphasizing illegal fishing here and fisheries management because it's very important. Again, nobody knows the solution to a problem more than the person that is suffering or experiencing the problem, in that they might have played with ideas of the potential solution. And I can give you one practical example. Recently, one of the vessels that I highlighted, I believe it was Menzing 10, was captured by pirates. This was in March. And even though potentially it might be that the company had paid a ransom because they were released after a month in a very remote area in Nigeria. They didn't know where they were. It was the local people, the first local that they saw, assisted them, gave them a phone, they called their embassy. The embassy were able to locate and work with Nigeria and Ghana because they were taken from Ghana and they were brought back. And so I'm using this to highlight the example of how it is practically impossible for us to address the highest level of threats that we face in our respective communities and those that have trickled in as criminality at sea without working with the local communities. I mean, for illegal fishing or for fisheries, it can be reflected in different ways. We've already been hearing about how local fishers are contributing to the solutions and how different countries have different mechanisms. And so this is basically to reiterate that importance. And then there is also the opportunities combined maritime task force. Although it's not fully operationalized, but I'm highlighting it as an opportunity because of the fact that if it were to work, if it actually gets the political blessings, which is currently what is missing. This is conversation that heads of navies have had and they've agreed on certain things, but then their heads of state have not even agreed or signed off on it, which is different because in relation to the Yaoundé Accord, it worked because the heads of state agreed and they gave their blessings for things to work. But currently conversations are happening, and even though at the AU level they've given their blessings, what needs to happen still must happen. The heads of state have to sanction it before it can go ahead. But the idea then is that already countries probably represented by their navies have already signed off or committed their interest to being part of it. And it's specifically in relation to joint patrols. I generated this from the internet just to reflect what it could mean, trying to incorporate technology and the various infrastructure needed to be present at sea. And just like the Yaoundé architecture, which is divided into zones, this one is also expected to be divided into zones. It could potentially have 3 different sectors: north based in Dakar, central based in Lagos or Cotonou, and then the south based in Point Noir. Again, this is still conversations that are happening. The extent to which it would happen depends on the heads of state of these countries giving their blessings. Of course, apart from Nigeria, who has in February at the AU meeting gave his blessings, other heads of state have not done so. And so, what are the areas for further improvement? Transparency is something that needs to happen, because if we're transparent about the ways we're operating, a lot of the issues we've talked about, corruption, um, being shortchanged when it comes to licensing or even fisheries agreement would not happen, because if you're going into that agreement, you're going because you believe you're going for the collective interest of your people rather than potentially the small gift or the backhand that you're likely to get. Um, Transparency also have to happen both ways. People that are coming to operate and engage with the countries have to also come from a place of clarity, making their ideas clear, because it's not a one-sided thing. There are examples I could give, but I think I would just continue with the presentation. I want to reiterate that technology can help. We've seen that it does help. As such, there is a need for synergy in existing technology, funding and training of personnel, align licensing rules and sanction across the states. So, for example, as I showed with the EU countries, if, for example, the punishment for committing fisheries act or fisheries crime, sorry, in Ghana is 1,000 cities, and in Cote d'Ivoire is 500,000 cities. I mean, illegal fishing vessels would likely do something in Cote d'Ivoire and escape to Ghana because they would rather be caught in Ghana. So there's a need for harmonization. We've already heard this already, and we need to also stop working in silos and work in synergy. Resolving maritime boundary disputes, including through joint management agreement. This is actually very important. There are so many examples of where maritime boundary disputes have stopped efforts to address threats, because the assumption, for instance, in allowing hot pursuit into their waters could be that this could be cited in future as an example of having legitimacy over those waters. There was an example one time where I believe it was in Sierra Leone, because they have this maritime boundary dispute, and the Guinean Navy or the Sierra Leone Navy accused them of, no, the Guinean Navy accused Sierra Leone of incursion into their waters when they were actually trying to stop some Chinese vessels from engaging in illegal fishing. And so, if really that the lines are blurred around the boundaries, maritime boundaries, and it cannot be resolved, and given or taken into account that, like I noted before, in resolving a lot of these disputes, the idea of agreements that were signed by colonial powers at the time is used in deciding, which obviously, in fairness, it doesn't make sense. If colonialism have ended, therefore, the agreements that were signed by colonial powers should not be rightfully what is used. And if we cannot change that, then countries must consider a joint management agreement. If we say that resources are transboundary, this is actually an example of where we can put our money where our mouth is, rather than spending years in disputes and not cooperating. We could consider joint management agreement as a way of solving a lot of these problems that we have already highlighted. The Yaoundé architecture and the combined task force could extend to combating illegal fishing and other threats. Of course, the Yaoundé agreement already had other maritime security threats in the accord itself, but in practice, their focus have for so long been on piracy, even though, as I noted earlier with the MOU, they are already helping and assisting with IUU fishing. And so I think there is a need for us to acknowledge piracy is a problem, but now start extending to other threats and giving them the mandate to do more and necessary support that they needed. And then for CMTF, now that it's still in the formative stage, if it is to happen, they should strongly consider incorporating other threats and working with other agencies and entities rather than making it this instrument that is there for joint patrols only for combating piracy and armed robbery at sea. Involving small-scale fishers, so yeah, and monitoring and other measures. So in conclusion, I want to note that cooperation and collaboration seems to be the only way forward to addressing not only illegal fishing, but a lot of the threats that we have already talked about. If we're not willing to engage with each other, if we're not willing to collaborate, we might not necessarily also be willing to even think about some of the solutions that at the regional level, for instance, the example I gave about the joint agreement, it might never happen if we're not already willing to cooperate and collaborate in combating a threat that affects us all in different ways, in combating a threat that obviously undermines food and economic security of millions of people in Western Central Africa, and by extension, undermines the peace and security of the region. Thank you so much for listening, and yeah.